All right, it's been reported that Hartley, who is the actor for The Flash, has been fired over old tweets that have racist and sexist content. Now, I don't think the issue onto itself is interesting because I'm not very familiar with Hartley as The Flash, and I have to be honest that on the whole, the CW and WB has not really been on my radar since Smallville. And so, just in terms of artistry, I really can't stand up for him and saying we're going to lose a really great Flash if they maintain the stance of firing him. But it is an interesting question because, as many people have already raised, this seems very parallel to the James Gunn situation just a few years ago where he was fired for pretty much the same thing, right? Old tweets, that old tweets were very offensive, and he was fired for that reason. But I think if you look more closely, they are really kind of apples and oranges. They're very close, but they're not really identical. With James, I think it was pretty apparent that he just had a lot of political enemies. They just used the old tweets. They said they were offended, and, they had to make a decision, and Disney fired him, at least for a while, in order to maintain consistency because they had done some other firings for political reasons as well, and so they were sort of stuck with not appearing to be completely hypocritical. But I think the WB is sort of in a weird situation where they can just say from a PR perspective, this just doesn't look very good if we maintain the Flash with these tweets. And on top of that, Hartley isn't super rich, but he is a series regular for the last couple seasons, and he has made a little bit of money, so it's more of a PR issue. Now, it's still political correctness, and it is still censorship, but it's sort of a very gray area where a corporation just does not want to be associated with X or Y, and they're just going to cut their losses. I can still lament it as an act of censorship, but I don't think it's at the level of James Gunn. And again, whatever I think of James Gunn, I'm not exactly a big fan of Guardians of the Galaxy. But even as an artist, and I want to be careful, I'm just using artist very, very broadly. I can honestly argue the case opposite. He's not much of an artist, but I don't think anyone would deny he's a very good craftsmanship in terms of filmmaking. I just think people are sort of stuck in two positions that they're not aware of. One is that the MCU, despite a lot of mythology, became very, very, very big, very, very quickly. And if the MCU had begun how it really was originally intended as this much more 15 and older kind of demographic, I don't think the tweets would have been much of an issue because their audience would have been much more mature. But as it turned out, it was much, much more popular. It became much more of a family brand. And I think this was the Disney dilemma that it just looks bad, whatever the content of the tweets. However, James is not just a director, he's also a comedian. And if you actually look at the tweets, however terrible they are or however offensive they are, they're clearly not his opinion. They're so outrageous and so offensive, they're not meant to be taken as his own beliefs. But Hartley is sort of differently because some of the tweets you can legitimately say are his own feelings. He's making a sort of jokey or ironic, layering, but this is what he actually thinks and believes. And so we're kind of stuck where should comedians be given special immunity, whereas, quote, other performers should not be? And I think, on balance, the evidence is yes, because that's the whole point of doing comedy. Comedy doesn't have to be offensive to be, quote, artistic, but if a comedian does do offensive material, that's what the material is. It's supposed to be offensive. If you're offended, well, that was the point of the material. So there's nothing, quote, inherently wrong with what they did. Now, even within that, there are, of course, boundaries, but you wouldn't say that the offensive comedian, because they were offensive, should be fired. That doesn't make any sense. And Disney was well aware that he was sort of a bit all over the place. Yes, he did family-friendly films, but his own sense of humor, if you look at his other films, is much more edgy, it's much more offensive, and so for them to act as if this was some kind of shock that they were completely unaware that James could say these things is kind of silly. So it is a tough saw, however. I mean, even if there is a legitimate role for comedy within, quote unquote, a democracy or a constitutional political society, yes, you do have some rights to censorship. I just think that it has to meet a very, very high bar before that's done. And I do think firing Hartley does amount to censorship, but it is a very weird gray area where business can have some rights legitimately. They just don't want to be associated with this or that just for the sake of profitability, and it is a business, so if they don't want to be associated with them, then that is their right. And this isn't coming out of just left field. This has been there for a whole week, so there has been some time to mull it over, whereas I think with James, it was way too reactionary. It was politically motivated, and he is a comedian, so it's a different set of criteria. But it is an open question about how far, quote unquote, an artist or even a comedic artist does have the right to be offensive before they go beyond a certain point. So more information could come in. Maybe Hartley can reframe himself as a comedian, but I just don't think that's going to be a legitimate defense. So I'm going to put it to just the audience. What do you think? Do you think this is, can cancel culture run amok, or is this sort of, again, it's a very gray area, but it is legitimate for the WB to just cut their ties and cut their losses with Hartley? All right, this has been the very difficult issue of censorship in the arts and popular culture. If you like the content, please smash the like button, and thank you for listening. Please be safe.